Welcome to the presidential address of the Society of Biblical Literature for the year 2020. It takes a form that none of us expected and that all of us regret, but this is the form in which we must do it this year. So this presidential address will be virtual. It is my pleasure to introduce Adele Reinhartz, President of the Society of Biblical Literature for the year 2020. But it is also a daunting responsibility because she is so accomplished. In the next few minutes, I will attempt to do some justice to her impressive record. Adele took her BA degree from the University of Toronto in 1975 and her MA at McMaster University in 1977 with a thesis entitled The Abraham Midrashim. For her doctoral work, she continued at McMaster, receiving her degree in 1983. Her dissertation, directed by Ed Sanders, bore the title John 20, 30 to 31 and the Purpose of the Fourth Gospel. It was the beginning of her interaction with the Gospel of John that continues to the present. Adele's studies led to a career at several universities in Canada and indeed around the world. Her initial appointment came while she was still in her doctoral program. She began in the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Toronto in 1981 and remained there until 1987, at which point she took up a position at McMaster in its Department of Religious Studies. She remained at McMaster until 2002, and while there became an associate dean in the School of Graduate Studies. McMaster was the first to recognize her administrative gifts, but certainly not the last. Although she maintained her connection with McMaster as an adjunct professor in the Department of Religious Studies from 2002 to 2012, in 2002 she became the Dean of the Faculty of Graduate Studies and Research at Wilfrid Laurier University and held the office until 2005, while also being a professor in the Department of Religion and Culture. Her next stop was her present location, the University of Ottawa. At Ottawa, she is a professor in the Department of Classics and Religious Studies, while from 2005 to 2007, she was the Associate Vice President for Research. She is also an affiliate of the Institute of Feminist and Gender Studies, has a cross appointment to the School of Music, and is currently the chair of the Department of Classics and Religious Studies. A colleague there speaks highly of her innovative leadership at a challenging time, calls her a wonderful model and collaborator, and commends her for how clear, considerate, and constructive she is in meetings, whether she agrees with or differs from what others are saying. Adele has held visiting positions in a number of institutions around the world. They include universities in Canada, the United States, South Africa, Germany, and Israel, as well as the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. She was awarded the highest honor an academic can receive in Canada when she was appointed a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada in 2005. Time constraints allow only a summary of comments I have received from Adele's students. Words that figure in them are authentic and genuine, terms for Adele's relationship with students and for what she encourages them to be in their research and writing. One calls her an incredibly understanding person who pushes students to be the very best they can be. Or Adele has always provided me with thoroughly helpful, practical, and wise advice about how to make my way in academia as a junior scholar. Another said she guides without hovering. So much has she served as a role model that one group of graduate students used the acronym WWAD, What Would Adele Do?, out of admiration for her as teacher, researcher, and mentor. One described Adele's attitude toward scholarship in this way: take it seriously, work hard and accurately, be critical, but enjoy what you are doing and don't forget to live. Her mentoring of students takes place not only during their degree programs, but continues after graduation. As a former student said, she keeps Adele's advice at the forefront of my work today, and another called her guidance and support a divine blessing. It is no surprise that twice she has won the Mentoring Award from the Society of Biblical Literature's Committee on the Status of Women in the Profession. Adele's writing and research have garnered international attention and a great deal of funding, such as 9 grants from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, almost all of them for multiple years. 3 of her books are on the Gospel of John. About them, a professional colleague writes, quote, Adele is perhaps best known for her career-spanning critical engagement with the Gospel of John. The Word in the World, her first book, mapped the ways that the evangelist moved his story along through constructions of cosmology. In her award-winning Befriending the Beloved Disciple, a Jewish reading of the Gospel of John, she sat the evangelist down over dinner to elicit a richly imagined conversation between the two of them. Finally, and most recently in Cast Out of the Covenant, Adele has named, traced out, and analyzed the strategic, still powerful deployment of anti-Judaism in John's Gospel, end of quote. As some of the book titles indicate, Adele's work has involved her in interfaith dialogue between Jews and Christians. Other publications in biblical studies are her Caiaphas the High Priest and Why Ask My Name? Anonymity and Identity in Biblical Narrative, also an award winner. Adele has, moreover, moved outside of traditional biblical studies to write 3 books on cinema. The first was Scripture on the Silver Screen, followed by Jesus of Hollywood, and The Bible in Cinema, an introduction. A colleague comments about them, these have been foundational for the academic study of film, examining the ways that movies mediate the Bible. In addition to her books, Adele has served as an editor on a number of projects. The publications in this category, like her books, show the range of her expertise, extending from the Gospel of John to cinema, purity, Christian anti-Judaism, the work of Northrop Frye, and the much discussed Common Judaism. Her many contributions to other volumes echo these areas of interest. She has, for example, contributed to the Jewish Study Bible and the Women's Bible and Commentary, as well as an essay, A Jewish Woman's Society of Biblical Literature Experience in Women and the Society of Biblical Literature. She has composed analyses of the Greek Esther, women in different ancient works, feminist criticism, and the parting of the ways. She often gives eye-catching titles to her articles, such as Better Homes and Gardens, Women and Domestic Space in the books of Judith and Susanna. Needless to say, she has had numerous essays accepted for publication in peer-reviewed journals, and many more have been included as chapters in books or reference works. She's also written encyclopedia articles and many book reviews, as well as a number of more popular publications. Additionally, she has presented lectures in many venues, whether at academic conferences or as invited speeches. She has been a regular contributor to the programs of the annual meetings of the SBL, the International SBL, the Canadian Society of Biblical Literature, and the SNTS. She's also delivered many popular addresses. Students have told me how formative Adele's publications have been in their careers. With reference to her Befriending the Beloved Disciple, one wrote, her book made me realize that scholarly work can be well-researched, cleverly structured and argued, and above all, highly enjoyable to read. Commenting on her recent Cast Out of the Covenant and her edited volume, The Gospel of John and Jewish-Christian Relations, a fellow scholar of the New Testament said, quote, that her work combines detailed historical critical analysis with a keen sense of what is at stake religiously for those who hold either to earlier constructions of the so-called Johannine community behind the text, to how the text has been and should be proclaimed to the Christian faithful. She has a rare gift for being clear, direct, and critical, and at the same time being respectful of those who offer alternative readings to hers. Many could take lessons from her model of civility, end of quote. Adele belongs to a number of organizations and has taken an active role in them, much to their benefit. She has served on committees of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council and the Canadian Society of Biblical Literature, of which she has been vice president and president. I want to focus, however, on her roles in the Society of Biblical Literature. She has held leading positions in the sections Women in the Biblical World, Johannine Literature, and Families in Early Christianity. From 2006 to 18, she was on the Research and Publications Committee, chairing it from 2010 to 12. She was a member of the SBL Council from 2009 to 15, and for the last 2 years has returned to it as vice president and now president of the society. She was a member of the Journal of Biblical Literature editorial board from 2002 to 10, and in 2012 was appointed general editor, a post she held until 2018. I was delighted to hand over to her the editorship of JBL in 2012, and especially pleased that someone so capable and well organized was leading it. Adele edited the journal with distinction through a period of change from heavy reliance on paper and snail mail to its present digital form. I can attest personally to her superb contributions to the work of committees and boards, as both of us have been members of the SBL Council this past year. She is one of those people who comes to a meeting not only fully informed about the issues, but also ready with helpful observations in discussions and thoughtful insights for handling issues. I should add that Adele has been involved in choral singing since childhood. For the past several years, she has been singing in the University of Ottawa Choir and currently is involved in 3 virtual choirs, including the University Choir, which, as she says, is tiding her over until it becomes possible to sing in person again. Adele and her husband, Barry Wallfish, an expert on medieval Jewish biblical interpretation, have 4 children and 3 grandchildren. Their family includes 4 members of SBL, she and Barry and their daughter Miriam Sima and her husband Michael. Saluting her many accomplishments, celebrating her many contributions to interfaith dialogue, to professional mentoring, to first-rank biblical scholarship, and to SBL, I now happily present the president of the Society of Biblical Literature for 2020, Adele Reinhartz.
Thank you very much, Jim, for that lovely introduction. I'm speaking to you today from the campus of the University of Ottawa. I acknowledge the respect that we pay to the Algonquin people, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their longstanding relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region, from all nations across Canada, who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. My talk today is called The Hermeneutics of Chutzpah, a disquisition on the values of critical investigation of the Bible. In our family, there are 2 doctors. I'm the elder Dr. Reinhartz, PhD in Biblical Studies. But my brother, Dr. Reinhartz, MD, he's the real Dr. Reinhartz. If I have spent the past 40 years in lecture halls and meeting rooms, my brother has spent those same decades at patient bedsides, providing care and compassion to those in need of healing. To his credit, my brother has steadfastly refused the obvious implications of this comparison. This is not just because he is a truly fine person who loves his sister, despite the torments she inflicted on him as a child. It is also because he, like many others, appreciates the inherent value in pursuits that may not directly save lives or stimulate the economy, but that potentially at least can enrich and deepen knowledge, justice, and equality. I would still rank medicine higher than academia on a scale of values, but that's my problem, not his. Now, I love teaching, and I love my students even more. I also mostly enjoy research and writing, and I fully endorse the arguments regarding the vital role of the humanities for understanding the past, navigating our present, and envisioning the future. As a graduate student, however, I often question the social value of a PhD in biblical studies. During those years, I volunteered weekly in the psychiatric unit of the large teaching hospital on campus, facilitating recreational activities for a group of teenage inpatients. After some initial trepidation, I came to enjoy my interactions with these young people tremendously. And I wondered, what was the point of spending hours poring over obscure texts in ancient languages when I could be helping others? I briefly contemplated a move to social work or even medicine, but was deterred by my proven incompetence in the required areas of statistics and science. Later, as I struggled with my dissertation and fretted about academic prospects, I decided that law school was the answer. I duly wrote the LSATs and submitted my applications. But the very week that the acceptances came in, my spouse and I learned happily that we would be welcoming our first child the very week that my law school career would have begun. All this is to say that I'm here before you today only because of dubious reasoning, that graduate school was more compatible with raising a family than law school, and that academia offered more flexibility than did a law career. Those of you who are raising or have raised children surely know what I soon learned, that flexible does not mean easy. But that's a subject for another time. The mad pace of life in a family with 4 children and 2 careers did not allow much time for contemplation and soul-searching. Who can worry about ultimate value when there are lunches to prepare, storybooks to read, classes to teach, and tenure ladders to climb? Even once our nest emptied, my days remained too full to return to the existential questions of my younger years. The COVID-19 crisis interrupted life as I knew it. Staying put was a not entirely unwelcome change, except that it ended playtime with our grandchildren and visits with distant loved ones. And staying home offered no distraction from anxiety about the human toll exacted by the virus and about climate change, the racist underbelly of our society, and the vagaries of American politics, which can be traumatizing even from our Canadian perch. In this fraught context, the question of value came roaring back. It was crystallized for me by a slim book entitled The Historian's Craft that I reread early on in our COVID isolation. The Historian's Craft was written by the French-Jewish economic historian Marc Bloch in 1941. Bloch's point of departure was a question posed by his young son. "Tell me, Daddy, what is the use of history?" Bloch confided in his readers, "Behold, then, the historian called to render his accounts. He does so not without an inner tremor." Bloch then asks, and I paraphrase, "What craftsperson, grown old in their trade, has not asked themselves with a sudden qualm whether they have spent their life wisely?" Having grown old in my own trade, I too am pondering this question. And so I ask, what is the use of biblical studies? Of what value is the critical investigation of the Bible, to which I have devoted most of my adult life? I generally shy away from big questions, preferring the concrete and nitty-gritty. In this case, I found purchase by beginning not with value writ large, but with the core values listed on the Society of Biblical Literature website: accountability, collaboration, collegiality, critical inquiry, inclusivity, respect for diversity, scholarly integrity, and tolerance. This list is overdue and slated for revision, but even as it stands, it is meant to convey a positive and welcoming message. On the basis of my personal experience alone, I would give the SBL an enthusiastic grade of A for the value it has added to my career and my life. Frankly, I do not know how I would have succeeded without the encouragement from senior scholars or the opportunities to participate in sessions or on committees, editorial boards, and council. Through the SBL, I have met colleagues, acquired mentors, and made lifelong friends. I am painfully aware, however, that many others have had more mixed or even negative experiences with and within the SBL. Our value as a learned society and a scholarly community must be measured not by those of us who have flourished, often assisted as I have been, by privileges of race, class, and location, but by those who struggle. To measure up, we must reframe the values of diversity, inclusivity, and tolerance, and commit instead to equity and justice. We must engage in our teaching and scholarship with a spirit of collegiality, collaboration, and openness to change. And to do so, we must be accountable to one another as scholars and as human beings. These values must inform our critical inquiry, that is, our practice of critical investigation of the Bible. Let us begin then, in honor of my late compatriot, Alex Trebek, with a brief round of Jeopardy. In the category academic, for $300 US, $200 Canadian. This field involves the academic study of biblical texts and their contexts, as well as of the traditions and contexts of biblical interpretation. Clearly, the answer is, what is critical biblical scholarship? In our field, the term critical biblical scholarship usually signifies the application of specific philological and historical critical methodologies that aid in the analyses of the languages, manuscripts, materials, and so on that are broadly relevant to the books, places, and peoples of the Bible. Most of us absorbed this definition from the earliest days of our graduate education. But the term critical itself has other meanings. One is critical, as in verging on the dire. The patient is in critical condition. A second is critical, as in passing negative judgment, something we all do, even if we don't admit it. And a third is critical, as in extremely important. We must do this now. Taking these meanings together, I argue that it is critical for our discipline and our SBL that we critically examine the underlying structures of our field and the dynamics of social power that these structures foster. I am by no means the first president of SBL to call for such a reexamination. Indeed, several of my predecessors, including Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza, Vincent Wimbush, Fernando Segovia, and most recently, Brian Blount and Gail Yee, have drawn attention to these systemic inequalities in our guild. Today, I add my voice to theirs in the hope that our field can and will be transformed. It can be tempting to address the issue of inequalities from one's own social location or standpoint. Certainly, as a Jewish New Testament scholar, I can testify to the ongoing presence of Christian supersessionism and subtle anti-Judaism in some, though not all, New Testament scholarship. And as a female scholar, I am by no means oblivious to misogyny, patriarchy, the underrepresentation of women in our journals, and the frustrating ubiquity of manals and manthologies. Brown, Asian, LGBTIQ, differently abled, and other colleagues have drawn attention to their own intersectional and marginalized positions in our field. My present reflections, however, are grounded not in my own identity, but in what I have been learning from and about Africana and primarily African American biblical scholarship. Indeed, at our present moment, I cannot imagine speaking to you about anything else. And at the same time, I can only reflect on and respond to what I've been learning as myself, as mentioned, a white Jewish female New Testament scholar of a certain age. In the months since the murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, I have been immersing myself in African American history, society, and culture, in reading about history, society, and culture, with particular attention to the long and fascinating history of African American biblical interpretation. This history includes appropriation, resistance, and reception in song and story, in theology, preaching, political activism, and yes, biblical exegesis. Among my favorite works are the memoirs, or better, the freedom narratives, of Frederick Douglass and many others who wrote vividly about their own experiences as enslaved and then free persons. I was especially moved by Harriet Jacobs' account, entitled Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, completed in 1858 and published in 1861. Jacobs' narrative is chilling in its descriptions of the brutality and sexual predation that enslaved women faced from their white so-called masters. But it is also uplifting as a testimony to her grit, intelligence, and resilience. One element that wends its way through African American writings is the hermeneutical stance of sass, or backtalk. This stance is evident in the ways that Jacobs and Douglas, for example, rebuke Southern white preachers for betraying Christian values, and in present-day scholarship that calls out the white Eurocentric history and premises of our field. Sass and backtalk align with an attitude close to my own heart, the attitude of chutzpah. This afternoon, then, I argue for the hermeneutics of chutzpah, as practiced by African American biblical interpreters, as a lens through which to interrogate the dynamics of social power in our field, and as a path to recommitting to the values of equity and justice in our practice of critical biblical scholarship. Chutzpah is a Yiddish term that can mean rudeness or shameless gall. In a more meaningful way, however, chutzpah, like sass, issues a challenge to oppressive authority structures. Whether chutzpah is perceived as insolent or as salutary may depend on whether one is the target of chutzpah or an innocent bystander. But if the goal is to disrupt complacency, chutzpah can be highly effective. Like the hermeneutics of suspicion, the hermeneutics of chutzpah is attentive to the ideologies that underlie our scholarship. And like the stance of resistant reading, chutzpah situates itself along those who are marginalized within the text, in the history of interpretation, and in or by an interpretive community. To suspicion and resistance, however, the hermeneutics of chutzpah adds a certain je ne sais quoi, a freshness to one's critique. Through chutzpah, one can assert one's agency and say what needs to be said. And now, I must state, with un-Canadian bravado, that I myself have a prodigious talent for chutzpah, or at least, so I was told by my parents throughout my rebellious adolescence. Their protest to the contrary, however, it was my own parents and grandparents, Polish Jews in the middle of the 20th century, who were my role models in the chutzpah department. My paternal forebears spent the Holocaust years in Siberia, while my grandmother, a political activist for the Jewish Labor Bund, was imprisoned in a gulag. Her husband and her teenage son, my grandfather and my father, worked 12-hour shifts in a Soviet munitions factory from which my father regularly stole firewood to heat their tiny shack through the long winters. After the war, they bummed around Central Asia, as my father put it, looking for my grandmother, until they stumbled upon her name on a list of Polish Jews who had ended up in Tel Aviv. They reunited, made their way to Paris, and in the late 1940s, to Canada. My maternal forebears also had well-honed chutzpah skills. Throughout their years in the Lodz ghetto, at Auschwitz, and other concentration and slave labor camps, my mother, my aunt, and my grandmother focused on sheer survival. Occasionally, they indulged in satisfying, if unwise, outbursts of anti-Nazi chutzpah, for which they were punished, but not miraculously killed. Even after surviving the Holocaust, it took no small measure of chutzpah, also known as courage, for these three women, penniless refugees in post-war Europe, to traverse Germany in search of lost family, and to smuggle themselves in and out of Brussels and Paris. Eventually, they journeyed by sea to Canada and began anew in a kinder, gentler, but nevertheless foreign country. As my mother learned English and adapted to the customs and caste systems of her new home, she frequently exercised her chutzpah on behalf of her family. As a child, I was embarrassed by my mother's chutzpah, just as she could be infuriated by my own. But as an adult, I deeply value this trait in my family members and wherever I have seen it deployed for the greater good. My practice of chutzpah in no way measures up to the high standards set by my family, nor, thankfully, have I faced their challenges. And while my chutzpah towards my parents diminished once my prefrontal cortex reached maturity, my often farchutzpah stance within academia has only become more pronounced as I've grown older, more crotchety, and less deferential. Chutzpah itself has a long and vital history throughout the Jewish and Christian interpretive traditions and in the Bible itself. Upon hearing of God's plans to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham challenges God, "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" And when Jesus, in a mean-spirited moment, refuses to cast a demon out of a Syro-Phoenician girl, her mother snaps back, "Even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." Whether African-American sass is emboldened by such texts, I do not know. But I do believe that the chutzpah practiced by such interpreters can be particularly helpful for our transformation as a field in at least two ways. One is by calling out hierarchies of space, the scholarly electric fences, so to speak, at conference podia, within our publications, or on the tenured or tenure tracks of our universities. I call this the chutzpah of space. A second way is by identifying the hierarchical structures that are deeply embedded in our long-standing exegetical methods. I call this the chutzpah of hermeneutics. It is not enough, however, to sketch out these paths. After all, chutzpah isn't chutzpah unless it elicits a response. What is the point of issuing a challenge that only those who already agree with you can see, hear, or read? More often than not, chutzpah is met with a negative response, typically from those who benefit from the status quo. And perhaps some of you listening to me right now are poised to click on "Leave the meeting" at this very moment. Yet I would suggest that our core values, our ability to foster critical biblical scholarship with integrity, and our value to society at large require us all, no matter how we identify, to embrace the challenges and the opportunities that the African-American hermeneutics of chutzpah lays before us. First, then, to the chutzpah of space. I was just a toddler when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled on Brown versus Board of Education, and when Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat. But as a slightly older child in the late 1950s and in the 1960s, I watched intently as the Little Rock Nine were blocked from integrating into Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas, as Little Ruby Bridges was escorted by federal marshals into William Frantz Elementary School in New Orleans, and as 4 African-American college students refused to leave the Woolworth's whites-only lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina. At the time, I processed these events as most children do. How would I have felt in the same situation? But as a child of Holocaust survivors, I drew a simple straight line between Black segregation in America and anti-Semitism in Nazi Europe, and I extended my sense of outrage over the latter to stretch over the former as well. Later, of course, I came to understand that the events I had seen unfold on our black and white TV were only a small part of a long and tragic history. I learned that just as Nazi ghettoization, policed by soldiers, guns, and dogs, was a pillar of the Nazi program of genocide, so was the systemic restriction of space a central feature of American anti-Black racism, controlling access to schools, water fountains, and neighborhoods, and fundamentally reflecting deep-seated views about what sorts of people have full rights to live and vote among young Americans. A similar situation, of course, existed in South Africa under apartheid. Through my reading, it has surprised me to learn that even some of the most ardent white abolitionists did not believe that Black people could ever live as equals among white people of European descent. Take Samuel Sewall, for example. In his treatise on the selling of Joseph, written in 1700, Sewell argued that if it was unjust for Joseph's brothers to sell him into slavery, so it is, quote, most lamentable, unquote, that Africans were sundered from their countries and their families, transported to the colonies in life-threatening conditions, and held as slaves. For they too, quote, are sons of Adam and have equal right unto liberty and all other outward comforts of life, end quote. Yet Sewell did not envision that Africans could ever live as free people among whites. For in his words, quote, there is such a disparity in their conditions, color, and hair that they can never embody with us and grow up into orderly families to the peopling of the land. The white abolitionist Samuel Hopkins expressed similar sentiments in his dialogue concerning the slavery of Africans, written in 1776, just prior to American independence. Hopkins viewed slavery, quote, as a gross and open violation not only of the genius and precepts of Christianity, but of the rights and feelings of humanity. And yet, Hopkins believed that upon emancipation, men and women of African descent should either be deported to Africa or, quote, be removed into those places in this land where they might have profitable businesses, end quote. That is, the places where whites prefer not to live. Just as we cannot draw a straight line between the Holocaust and mid-20th century American anti-Black racism, so must we beware of drawing too close a connection between 18th and 21st century attitudes of white Americans. And yet, the comments of Sewell, Hopkins, and other white abolitionists, to say nothing of pro-slavery apologists, show just how strong was the desire to keep Black people out of spaces claimed as white. Today, even after such practices are no longer supported by legislation, there remain physical and metaphorical spaces in American life in which African Americans are unwelcome. And I regret to say that some of these spaces exist within our own learned society, our stated values and policies notwithstanding. Many Africana scholars have stories of discomfort and exclusion, of loneliness and frustration. Gifted Black students are passed over in favor of white students. Emerging scholars hope in vain for mentorship, encouragement, and enough funding to attend our meetings. And then there is the experience of looking around a conference session to find themselves the only Black person in the room. In his classic work, The Souls of Black Folk, first published in 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois declared that, quote, the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, end quote. As Brian Blount stressed in his 2018 presidential address, African Americans were, and in the 21st century still are, on the wrong side of that physical and existential demarcation. If our guild were truly living up to our stated commitment to equity and justice, it would not require chutzpah for any Africana or otherwise marginalized person to be present in any space, physical, virtual, or metaphorical, in our society or in our field. Repurposing our pervasively white spaces, however, is not accomplished simply by adding non-white scholars to our editorial boards, committees, panels, or publications. By analogy, I can attest personally that the move to add token women to university and other committees in the 1980s and 90s did not automatically grant us an equal voice, but it did add considerable labor to our overflowing plates. As Geraldine Cochran, an African-American STEM professor at Rutgers, has emphasized, an inclusive environment does not simply mean that people from various groups are included. It is concerned with what their inclusion means in that environment. The chutzpah required to enter some physical spaces is nothing, however, to the chutzpah needed to enter the areas or subfields from which certain people may not be formally banned, but in which you, whoever you are not particularly welcome. I, like other Jewish New Testament scholars, and anyone whose interests venture outside the borders of their own faith or ethnic communities, am sometimes made to feel like a trespasser. how much more chutzpah must it take for an Africana or other person of color to step into the whiteness of our discipline? Now I turn to the chutzpah of hermeneutics. To create an environment in which justice can flourish, I recommend the chutzpah of hermeneutics, an essential component of the hermeneutics of chutzpah. In African-American biblical interpretation, chutzpah is mobilized not only for entering the spaces implicitly or overtly designated as white, but also for revising translations and interpretations that presume that whiteness is normative, and for critiquing the methods and assumptions that produce such readings in the first place. In general, our field has come around, more or less, to the view that scholarship is not value neutral. Yet there are many on the white side of the color line who do not see, as Ekaputra Tupamahu has recently written, that, quote, whiteness is the host, the owner of biblical scholarship, and everyone else is just a guest, end quote. If this point is opaque to some of us, it is transparent to Africana and all non-white biblical interpreters. John W. Waters, for example, states that, quote, it seems to be the hallmark of Western Eurocentric biblical scholars to seize upon every opportunity to read their racial biases into the interpretation and translation of the ancient biblical text. Our graduate and divinity schools, notes William Myers, teach that, quote, the Eurocentric approach is without cultural bias and constitutes the normative way by which all other approaches are tested. Returning to the words of Tupamahu, biblical scholarship training is a whitewashing machine. The pushback against such whitewashing takes many forms, but I briefly engage three areas: Bible translation, biblical exegesis, and historical critical methodology. On the matter of translation, the diverse renderings of Song of Songs, chapter 1, verse 5, are a good example. In the Hebrew, the woman lover describes herself in this way, Shchora ani v'na'ava. The Septuagint adopts a literal translation, Melaina emi kai kale. The Hebrew vav and the Greek kai can mean either and or but. The translations of the New Revised Standard Version chose and translated the verse as, I am black and beautiful. By contrast, the translators of the King James Version chose but, I am black but comely. And those of the New International Version chose yet, dark am I, yet lovely. Now, all of these are technically correct, but the choice of whether to use but or yet or and reflects a value system, but or yet reflects a value system in which blackness is neither beautiful nor desirable. I remain partial to Marcia Falk's brilliant rendition, yes, I am black and radiant. For biblical exegesis, I turn to readings of Acts 8:26 to 40. In this story, an Ethiopian eunuch, a courtier of the Ethiopian queen, was reading the prophecies of Isaiah while being driven to Jerusalem in a chariot. On a tip by the Holy Spirit, the apostle Philip went out to meet him, and in response to the Ethiopian's questions, began to teach him. The Ethiopian was so impressed that he asked Philip to baptize him then and there. Many studies of this passage are preoccupied with what it meant to be a eunuch in the late 1st century, but few consider what it meant to be an Ethiopian. Scholars argue over whether he was a Gentile or whether he was rather a Jew, but many downplay or simply ignore his blackness. In her important study of this passage, however, Clarice Martin demonstrates that for Luke's ancient audiences, the Ethiopian's blackness would not have been an incidental detail. Rather, it would have been a central feature of his literary characterization. And for present-day African-American readers, she states, quote, the story of a black African convert to Christianity continues to comprise a culturally affirming and empowering tradition. Gay Byron's wide-ranging study, called Symbolic Blackness and Ethnic Difference in Early Christian Literature, takes the same story as one springboard for examining the ethnopolitical rhetoric, comprising both pejorative and idealized representations that shaped ancient constructions of Christianity and that still resonate today. The discussions of the Ethiopian eunuch point to a far-reaching problem: the tendency not only to ignore biblical blackness, but to overlay white European identity onto biblical figures that could not possibly have been white. As Will Gaffney tirelessly points out, ancient Israel was an Afro-Asiatic country. Why would we expect Israelites or Jesus to look like Renaissance Europeans when even a cursory glance at the map will show that ancient Israel was situated at the intersection of Asia and Africa? I would add that one can scarcely understand why so many wars have been fought over this sliver of land without acknowledging its strategic geopolitical location and its economic and cultural ties to both Africa and Asia. The most sensitive aspect of the chutzpah of hermeneutics concerns historical critical methodology. With few exceptions, introductory textbooks and courses continue to describe source, form, and redaction criticism as objective, even scientific approaches that are the core of critical investigation of the Bible. It is worth remembering, however, that these methods and our field as a whole were shaped in Europe of the 18th and 19th century, and they are infused with the racialized philosophical and cultural categories of their day. The era was characterized by a categorizing compulsion, a drive to create taxonomies, groupings, and hierarchies in the mineral, plant, animal, and human worlds. According to these taxonomies, white Christian Europeans were fully civilized, the apex of humanity. Jews were semi-civilized, the teenagers of the caste system, who could sometimes, but not always, become more, if never fully civilized, by converting to Christianity. Africans, however, were on the lowest rung, incapable of civilization. The exclusion of Africa and Africans from the sweeping European narrative of historical progress was a feature of Hegel's grand philosophy, which in turn was foundational for our own field. In light of this history, as Vincent Wimbush has stated, of course the authoritative interpretive disposition is white. How could it be otherwise? Some scholars criticize not only the traditional approaches of source, form, and redaction criticism, but the historical enterprise as such. William Myers is critical of historical scholarship because, quote, it reads the text solely as a product of history. It overemphasizes text production and text mediation and places the reader in a passive as opposed to an active state, while condescending to, debasing, and otherwise excluding the oral traditions and methods of interpretation resident in minority culture. I see Myers' point. So much of our scholarship does involve quibbling over the one right meaning of a particular verse, passage, figure, or book. Was Joseph sold or stolen? Was Paul within Judaism or without Judaism? Was Jesus rude to his mother at the Cana wedding, or does it just sound that way? Now, I have never put much store, personally, in source, form, or redaction criticism, but I would resist the idea of discarding historical questions altogether. This is no doubt due to my own fascination with the ancient histories and prehistories of Jews and Christians, which propelled me into our field to begin with. It is worthwhile, and yes, even possible, to avoid reductionism by considering the meanings in the plural that ancient sources as well as ancient sites and material artifacts might have had for the people who created and inhabited them, especially if we set aside a whitewashed graduate education. In fact, much African American scholarship is also deeply concerned with the original historical context and meanings, and it also draws on philology, historical contextualization, and comparative analysis to critique racist assumptions and interpretations. The work of Clarice Martin, Gay Byron, Randall Bailey, and so many others are persuasive precisely because they are grounded in detailed, contextual, historical, and philological analyses. but these scholars also make explicit two truths that our field often ignores. One is that even work that aims to uncover only the original meanings of a verse, book, site, or artifact is shaped by the theology and the histories of reception and interpretation over the centuries. The other is that our own interpretations may have consequences for today and tomorrow, whether intended or not. For these reasons, reception history, the histories of interpretation, appropriation, and even rejection of the Bible, cannot be neatly separated from biblical interpretation as such. In recent years, reception history has become quite accepted as a valid concern for biblical scholars. Nonetheless, the Bible's reception within African American history, society, and culture is rarely studied or even read by white scholars. This reception history, however, has much to teach us about all the ways in which the Bible has been deployed, in past and present, in the modalities of white and black, to violate and to nourish. More contentious, perhaps, are studies that explicitly relate biblical passages to interpreters' social locations or personal experiences. Mitzi Smith opens her analysis of the Syro-Phoenician woman by recounting the circumstances leading to the death of Sandra Bland in 2015. Smith's analysis affirms both the human and the exegetical value of sass by focusing on the Syro-Phoenicians' audacity in talking back to Jesus. Angela Parker bases her trenchant analysis of Paul's letter to the Galatians on her own identity and experience as the womanist mother of a young adult black male and as a heterosexual married black Christian woman who marches for social justice. Parker calls Paul out for, quote, his privileged use of marginalized identities, end quote, when he claims for himself the imagery of enslavement and birthing, neither of which he has experienced. Such studies are often criticized for contravening the norms of objectivity to which many biblical scholars continue to adhere. Yet it is obvious that even scholars who strive for objectivity often interpret the text on the basis of their own experiences, identities, and personal beliefs. Rather than masking their situated perspectives, Smith, Parker, and many others are explicit about the way these perspectives have shaped their readings. And in doing so, they call attention to potential meanings that other interpretations fail to uncover. If the chutzpah of space should elicit a response based on the values of equity and justice, the chutzpah of hermeneutics should be met by an openness to revising what we understand by critical biblical scholarship. Such openness does not require uncritical or unconditional acceptance of each and every interpretation. By putting their work out there, African American scholars, like everyone in the field, participate in the business of critical investigation of the Bible, which includes critique and disagreement. Nyasha Jr.'s work on Hagar offers an example of respectful yet critical response. Jr. reflects on earlier studies by Dolores Williams and Renita Weems. Williams discusses the parallels between the stories of the biblical Hagar as an enslaved African woman and generations of African American women with their own experiences and legacy of enslavement. Weems similarly views the story of Hagar and Sarah as a narrative that, quote, reinforces and coincides in some crucial ways with African American women's experience of reality. Nyasha Jr. expresses her appreciation for these works, but she also suggests that, quote, the fusion of Aunt Hagar and biblical Hagar to create analogies to African American experiences can lead us to neglect the richness of the African American cultural heritage and to privilege the biblical text over the particular real-life experiences of flesh and blood African Americans. She argues for the importance of knowing the traditions of Aunt Hagar, quote, instead of seeking to make the ancient literary past of the Bible relevant to our contemporary era, end quote. More broadly, womanist scholars have called attention to the disregard for gender and other intersectional issues in African American interpretation. In her study of the New Testament household codes, for example, Clarice Martin asks why the African American interpretive tradition rejects the literal interpretation of Colossians 3:22, slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, but not the literal interpretation of Colossians 3:18, wives, be subject to your husbands. One answer, she suggests, lies in the fact that, quote, many African Americans have accepted uncritically a socialization that tolerates and accepts the patriarchal model of male control and supremacy that typifies the Eurocentric Western Protestant tradition in general, end quote. Respectful disagreement can also be done, I would suggest, across the color line. It is probably not surprising that my own sensitivity to Christian anti-Judaism and supersessionism is triggered by the instances, albeit rare, in which African American authors portray Jews or Jewish groups negatively, even as they highlight the systemic racism of mainstream biblical interpretation. Examples include the use of the Pharisees as a negative foil, and in a recent article, the reference to the Jews as the dominant race in Acts. It should be well known that the portrait of the Pharisees as hypocrites in Matthew 23 was drawn for rhetorical force rather than historical accuracy. And while a majority of American Jews are white, Jewishness itself is not defined by race but affiliation. Jews come in all colors and all ethnicities. The very language of dominant race echoes Nazi race theory at the same time as it misrepresents the historical situation of first-century Jews under Roman colonial rule. In the examples I have seen, such language is inadvertently rather than intentionally anti-Jewish, but its occasional presence shows that even scholars who are rightly critical of white Eurocentric racism can have difficulty shaking the traces of Eurocentric Christian anti-Judaism. Conversely, it does my Jewish soul a whole lot of good when African American scholars such as Will Gaffney and J. Cameron Carter, to name but two, not only understand, but also talk about the historical, theological, and ideological connections between anti-Black racism and anti-Semitism. Those who need convincing of these links can take a quick peek at any white supremacist website today, or they can Google the images from the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. Now, some might ask, why should the SBL rethink its values in response to the chutzpah, the critique, mounted by African Americans, who account for less than 5% of our membership? In response, I cite Paul, not an author I turn to often for relationship advice. But in 1 Corinthians, Paul says something that applies to this situation. If one member suffers, all suffer together with it. If one member is honored, all rejoice together with it. We are all diminished when anyone among us is othered on account of who they are, what they look like, or how they identify. But there are other reasons why African American scholarship enriches our field, or as Paul might say, why we might all rejoice in it. As Vincent Wimbush has stressed for many, many years, African American modes of interpretation represent, quote, a challenge to the still largely unacknowledged, invested, racialized culture and ethnic-specific practice of biblical interpretation in the West. It is not that African American biblical scholarship provides the only avenue for challenging these practices, I suggest, but it may be the avenue that articulates the challenge most forcefully in our current moment. The Eurocentrism that has marginalized African American scholars and scholarship have also othered many others, including scholars who identify as East or South Asian, Indigenous, and/or Jewish, those who identify as LGBTIQ and/or gender non-binary, are differently abled, and perhaps the largest minority in our SBL society, those who identify as women. African American sass or chutzpah benefits other marginalized groups, as well as those who have traditionally situated themselves at the core of our guild. Such sass helps us all to perceive the workings of whiteness and to engage more honestly with the deep structures of our intellectual enterprise. But one might object, why should the SBL, a learned society that has an ever-growing international membership, focus so much attention on one specifically American interpretive community? I suggest two reasons. First, Eurocentric modes of biblical scholarship have been the norm not only in American, European, and other Western countries, but also in Africa and Asia, having been imported through colonization and cemented through globalization. As Marapwane, Messenya, and David Adamo have shown, the biblical studies curricula throughout Africa are thoroughly shaped by the same Eurocentric ideologies that African Americans are challenging. And finally, let us not overlook the pleasure and value of reading outside our own subfields. I have often ignored this advice myself until Black Lives Matter made it imperative to do so. Emotionally difficult as they often are, I've truly enjoyed my literary encounters with African Americans past and present, which have opened my eyes to the varied forms that engagement with the Bible can take. Furthermore, the critique of white Christian Eurocentrism provides a framework for making sense of the still present Christian supersessionism in biblical scholarship that I find so disturbing. This is not to say that I have read all I need to read or that I understand everything I have already read. I found myself wondering, for example, how and why the Bible has remained authoritative, given the degree to which it was, and still sometimes is, weaponized against Black bodies, minds, and spirits. Emerson Powery and Rodney Sadler attribute this devotion, even in the era of enslavement, to the love of the God of Scripture and a vision of salvation that, quote, resonated with aspects of the religions of their African forebears without debasing them. Renita Weems notes that, quote, the Bible or portions of it is believed to provide existential insight into the dilemmas that grip African American women's existence and reflect values and advocates a way of life to which African American female readers genuinely aspire, end quote. I understand that the Bible can be life-sustaining in ways that override its often violent deployment. Yet I do find myself applauding those who resist the authority of the biblical text that figured prominently in racist discourse. And so I cheer for David Walker, an early 19th century Black abolitionist who questioned why white Southern Christians insist that Africans and their descendants are the seed of Cain, when it is they who are enslaving and murdering others. However, Walker thundered, let us be the seed of Cain, Harry, Dick, or Tom. God will show the whites what we are yet, end quote. I also admire the chutzpah of Howard Thurman's grandmother, who famously promised that if she were ever freed, she would not read the letters of Paul that slave owners would cite, quote, to show how it was God's will that we were slaves, and how, if we were good and happy slaves, God would bless us, end quote. For the most part, however, the African American hermeneutics of chutzpah does not challenge the authority of the Bible, but rather of specific strands of interpretation. Renita Weems explains that it is not texts per se that function authoritatively, but rather it is reading strategies, and more precisely, particular readings that turn out, in fact, to be authoritative. I see the point, yet perhaps a little bit of chutzpah can and should be directed towards the Bible itself, which has made it possible for anti-Black, anti-Jewish, anti-LGBTIQ, and misogynist readings to become authoritative in the first place. Wimbush argued that centering African American biblical scholarship amounted to, quote, the decentering and explosion of all prevailing interpretive paradigms, end quote. I agree, but I prefer to stay away from the language of centering altogether. I propose that we will be better able to live up to our values and contribute to a just society if we not only decenter prevailing paradigms, but actively refrain from positing a new center or core for our practices of teaching and scholarship. Without a core, there are no margins. Now, please take note. I'm not suggesting that we dismantle our core subject matter, which covers all topics related in any way to what we conventionally call biblical literature. What I do ask is that we reject the spoken and unspoken hierarchies entrenched in the history and methodologies of our field in order to value the diverse scholars and scholarly methods already flourishing among us, if as yet unseen by many. I imagine our field not so much as a wheel, with many spokes emanating from a central hub, but rather as a large SBL reception where there is room to mill around. In fact, I wish we could all be there now, sampling the refreshments, chatting in small groups, and drifting out into the hallway and back again. Of course, rooms have centers too, but in my experience, the coveted spots at our receptions are not in the center, but at the bar and the buffet table located in multiple spots around the room. To bring this vision to fruition requires that our work be propelled not by present hierarchies or by new ones, but by what Wei Xianwan has called, quote, an ethical commitment to the other, end quote. Let us make a commitment to one another as scholars and as human beings, to treat one another with respect, even when we disagree about method or substance. Let us enact a willingness to learn from one another, including from those whom we perceive as different from ourselves, and to be open to new approaches, perspectives, and interpretations, whether or not we adopt them. Let us lean into our interdependence and infuse our scholarship and our classrooms with generosity of spirit and ample good humor. And let us see our guild as a place, to quote Juan again, where difference is not something we fear, but rather something we honor for its creative and generative powers, end quote. The hermeneutics of chutzpah can be productive insofar as it values such difference. But enacting an ethical commitment to the other can also require chutzpah. In speaking to you today on this topic, I had to overcome my own hesitation to speak about a community of scholars and a body of scholarship that are not directly related to who I am and what I usually do. But I am emboldened by the words of African-American colleagues. Angela Parker, for example, describes, quote, entering the narrative stories of others while recognizing our own privilege as the first step in bearing one another's burdens. Shively Smith invites, quote, allies and colleagues to join Africana scholars in our guild and faculty meetings, classroom sessions and syllabi design, scholarly books and refereed articles, collegial evaluations, and public lectures. The hands extended by these and so many other colleagues symbolize the value, the justice that an expansive and interdependent collegiality can bring to the SBL and beyond. In doing so, they bring to mind the words of W.E.B. Du Bois, quote, only by a union of intelligence and sympathy across the color line in this critical period shall justice and right triumph, that mind and soul, according well, may make one music as before, but vaster. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Adele Reinhartz, for such an excellent programmatic address. It is the tradition of the Society of Biblical Literature not to take questions following the presidential address, but rather to let each address stand as a mark of scholarship and a moment in time. This tradition recognizes the honor granted to the Society's president. A recording of today's address will be made available, and the introduction and the address will be published in the first issue of the 2021 Journal of Biblical Literature. It is also the tradition of the Society to present the president with a gift that inscribes her distinguished service. If you are able, please see the screen for the gift we present to her. It reads, in honor of Adele Reinhartz for distinguished service as Vice President and President of the Society of Biblical Literature, Council 2019 to 2020. Once again, our thanks to Dr. Reinhartz and our thanks to you for joining us today. Please stay safe and be well.